Think for a moment. Imagine that everything you were taught about Jesus is only the surface of a much deeper ocean. Imagine that beneath familiar images, sermons, and doctrines, there exists a luminous and unsettling truth, that the message of Jesus was not meant merely to be believed, but to be experienced as an inner awakening. Imagine that his words were not designed to create followers who look outward for salvation, but seekers who dare to turn inward and discover a living light within the soul. What if the greatest teaching of Jesus was never about distant heavens, but about a transformation that happens inside you? And what if the final insight revealed in this journey is the most powerful of all, capable of reshaping how you understand consciousness, divinity, and your own existence? Across centuries, mystics and philosophers have sensed that the teachings of Jesus carry layers far deeper than literal interpretation. His words seem simple, yet they echo endlessly in the minds of those who contemplate them deeply. This is because they belong to what scholars call perennial wisdom, a timeless stream of truth transmitted through symbols, parables, and sacred language. Long before organized religion took shape, ancient civilizations already spoke of an inner light, a divine spark hidden within the human being. Jesus did not invent this idea. He embodied it and gave it voice in a way that could reach fishermen, scholars, and kings alike. Ponder this carefully. When Jesus speaks of light, he does not describe an external flame or celestial object. He says, "The light of the body is the eye. If your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light." This statement alone opens a vast inner landscape of meaning. Esoteric traditions understand the single eye as unified consciousness, awareness no longer divided by fear, desire, or illusion. To be full of light is to live from the soul rather than from the fragmented ego. Here, light becomes synonymous with awakened awareness. Before continuing, if these reflections resonate with something deep inside you, take a moment now. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, share this video with those who feel drawn to spiritual depth, and write in the comments what the idea of inner light means to you personally. Stay with me, because what unfolds ahead will reveal mysteries that can profoundly alter how you see life, the universe, and your place within it. Jesus consistently pointed inward. When asked about the kingdom of God, he said it does not come with signs to be observed, nor can it be pointed out as here or there, because the kingdom is within you. This statement alone destabilizes purely external religion. It suggests that divinity is not confined to temples, institutions, or future rewards, but is an inner reality waiting to be realized. Early mystics understood this clearly. For them, salvation was not escape from the world, but illumination of the soul. Scholars such as Origen of Alexandria taught that sacred texts operate on multiple levels. The literal level speaks to the mind, but the spiritual level speaks directly to the soul. On this deeper level, Jesus becomes a living symbol of the awakened human being. His life represents the inner journey each person must undertake, the birth of awareness, the confrontation with inner darkness, the death of false identity, and the resurrection of higher consciousness. This interpretation aligns closely with Hermetic philosophy, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, which teaches that humans are both earthly and divine, asleep to their origin until knowledge awakens them. Consider the role of parables. Jesus rarely explained his teachings directly. Instead, he wrapped them in stories of seeds, lamps, weddings, and hidden treasures. Carl Jung later observed that symbols bypass the rational mind and speak directly to the unconscious. Parables are not meant to be solved intellectually, but contemplated inwardly. When Jesus speaks of a treasure hidden in a field, he is not merely describing moral virtue, but the divine essence concealed within the soul, waiting for those willing to give everything to uncover it. The light of the soul in this context is not a metaphor chosen at random. Light has always symbolized consciousness itself. To awaken is to see. To remain asleep is to walk in darkness. Jesus repeatedly contrasts light and darkness, not as moral judgments but as states of awareness. Darkness is ignorance of one's true nature. Light is remembrance of it. Modern historians such as Elaine Pagels have shown that early Christian communities preserved mystical interpretations of Jesus' teachings, many of which emphasized direct inner knowledge rather than external authority. These groups believed that Christ was not only a historical figure, but a principle of consciousness that could be realized within each individual. Over time, Many of these ideas were suppressed, but traces remain embedded in the sayings of Jesus for those with ears to hear. As we move forward, reflect on this question and hold it within you. If Jesus truly spoke of an inner light, why has humanity so often searched for it outside? And what would happen if you dared to seek it within yourself? The answers will unfold as we continue. Approve this part so we may proceed further into the deeper revelations that await. Know thyself, and thou shalt know the universe and the gods, attributed to the Delphic tradition, later echoed in Hermetic philosophy. Now, think more deeply. Imagine that the figure of Jesus is not only a teacher standing before a crowd, but a mirror held up to the soul of humanity. A mirror meant to reveal what we truly are beneath layers of fear, conditioning, and forgetfulness. When Jesus speaks of being born again, he is not referring to a physical rebirth, but to a radical inner transformation, a shift in consciousness so profound that the old self can no longer survive it. This is not symbolic exaggeration. It is the core of mystical awakening. In esoteric understanding, rebirth is the moment when the soul awakens to its own light. Ancient mystery traditions describe this process as illumination, remembrance, or awakening from spiritual sleep. Jesus expresses the same truth through spiritual language accessible to his listeners. When he tells Nicodemus that one must be born of water and spirit, he is describing purification of the emotional nature and awakening of higher awareness. Water cleanses the inner world, spirit ignites the inner light. Consider how often Jesus challenges identity. He asks his followers to leave behind family, possessions, and even their former names. This is not a rejection of human bonds, but a dismantling of the false self. Mystics across cultures agree that the ego identity must dissolve for the soul to shine unobstructed. The light of the soul cannot fully emerge while the individual clings to fear-based definitions of who they are. Hermetic teachings state that ignorance is the greatest bondage and knowledge is liberation. This knowledge is not intellectual accumulation, but direct inner knowing. Jesus echoes this when he says that the truth will set you free. Truth, in this sense, is not doctrine, but clarity of being. It is the moment when illusion falls away and the soul recognizes its divine origin. Freedom then is not political or social, but spiritual liberation from inner darkness. If this perspective feels challenging, pause and ask yourself why. Could it be that true spiritual teaching is meant to disturb complacency? Jesus was not executed for preaching kindness alone. He was perceived as dangerous because his message threatened systems built on control, fear, and external authority. By teaching that divine light dwells within, he undermined the idea that power must come from institutions or intermediaries. Take a moment here to reflect and interact. Do you believe spiritual authority comes from outside or from within? Write your thoughts in the comments and share this reflection with someone who questions traditional narratives. Stay attentive, because the layers we are about to uncover grow even more profound. The crucifixion itself holds deep esoteric meaning. Beyond historical and theological interpretations, it symbolizes the inner death required for awakening. The cross represents the intersection of the material and the spiritual, the horizontal plane of earthly life, and the vertical ascent of consciousness. To be crucified inwardly is to surrender the ego, the false self that resists transformation. Only through this inner death can resurrection occur. Resurrection, then, is not merely an event in time, but a state of consciousness. It is the soul rising into awareness of its eternal nature. Early Christian mystics understood resurrection as something to be experienced inwardly here and now. Paul himself said that Christ must be formed within you. This statement is revolutionary when taken seriously. It implies that the light of Christ is a latent reality within every human being, awaiting activation. Philosophers such as Plotinus later described this process as the return of the soul to the One. Although he lived centuries after Jesus, the harmony between their teachings is striking. Both describe a movement from multiplicity back to unity, from fragmentation back to source. Jesus expresses this unity when he says that he and the Father are one, not as a claim of exclusivity, but as a revelation of what awakened consciousness realizes. The light of the soul is therefore not something granted from outside, it is remembered. Forgotten through fear, distraction, and identification with form, it waits patiently beneath the surface of ordinary life. Jesus' teachings are designed to shake the soul awake, to disturb the illusion that we are separate, powerless, or abandoned in a meaningless universe. As we continue, keep this question alive within you. If the light Jesus spoke of already exists within your soul, what is preventing you from seeing it? And what illusions might need to fall for that light to finally emerge? Approve this continuation so we may proceed deeper into the heart of this mystery. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. Now allow this understanding to deepen even further. If Jesus was revealing the light of the soul, then his teachings were never meant to be passively admired. They were meant to be lived as an inner discipline, a continuous awakening that reshapes perception itself. This is why his words so often disturb comfort and certainty. They challenge the listener to step beyond habit, belief, and inherited identity. Spiritual light is not added to the soul. It is uncovered by removing what obscures it. Throughout the sayings attributed to Jesus, there is a recurring emphasis on vigilance. He urges his listeners to stay awake, to watch, to remain alert. These are not warnings about external danger alone. In mystical language, sleep represents unconscious living, a life guided by fear, impulse, and imitation. Awakening is the return of awareness to the present moment, where the soul can perceive truth directly. The light of the soul emerges when attention becomes clear and undivided. Consider the Sermon on the Mount. On the surface, it appears to be a collection of moral teachings, but read inwardly, it reveals a map of inner transformation. When Jesus speaks of purity of heart, he is not referring to moral perfection, but to inner clarity. A pure heart is a unified heart, free from inner division. Such a heart, he says, shall see God. Seeing God is not a physical act. It is perception awakened to reality as it truly is. This perspective aligns with ancient wisdom traditions that speak of inner alchemy. In Hermetic thought, transformation occurs when the base elements of the psyche are refined into spiritual gold. Fear becomes insight. Desire becomes devotion. Suffering becomes wisdom. Jesus expresses this alchemy through paradox. The last shall be first. Those who lose their life shall find it. These statements are not poetic exaggerations. They describe the reversal of consciousness that occurs when the soul awakens and the ego relinquishes control. Ask yourself something important here. Why do the teachings of Jesus continue to feel unsettling, even after centuries of repetition? Perhaps because they demand inner honesty. They strip away spiritual pretenses and confront the listener with their own inner state. Jesus speaks repeatedly about hypocrisy, not as moral insult, but as a condition of unconsciousness. To live divided between appearance and truth is to live without light. Modern psychology has rediscovered many of these insights. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as the process of becoming whole by integrating the unconscious. This mirrors the spiritual journey described in mystical Christianity. The light of the soul shines when hidden fears, denied emotions, and rejected aspects of the self are brought into awareness. Darkness is not destroyed by force. It dissolves in the presence of light. Jesus' emphasis on forgiveness also carries deep inner significance. Forgiveness is not merely a moral obligation toward others. It is liberation from the inner chains of resentment and identification with pain. When Jesus says to forgive endlessly, he is pointing toward freedom of consciousness. A soul bound by resentment cannot shine. Letting go is not weakness. It is illumination. Notice how often Jesus retreats into silence. He withdraws into the wilderness, away from crowds and noise. Silence, in mystical understanding, is not emptiness. It is the space where the soul hears truth without distortion. Silence allows the inner light to emerge naturally. This is why contemplative traditions within Christianity emphasized stillness, prayer of the heart, and inner watchfulness. They understood that spiritual light arises when the mind becomes quiet enough to receive it. Scholars such as Thomas Merton later emphasized this contemplative dimension, warning that spirituality without inner depth becomes performance rather than transformation. Jesus never sought admiration. He sought awakening. His harshest words were reserved not for sinners, but for those who mistook external religiosity for inner illumination. As this understanding unfolds, reflect on your own inner life. Where do you seek light outside yourself? Approval, certainty, authority, recognition? And what would happen if you turned inward with the same intensity? The teachings of Jesus suggest that the soul already knows the way. It only waits for attention, sincerity, and courage. Hold this question gently but firmly. If the light of the soul is real, how would your life change if you lived from it rather than searching for it? The answer to this question draws us closer to the final and most powerful revelation still ahead. Approve this part, so we may proceed to the final unfolding of this journey. What you seek is seeking you. Rumi. Now we arrive at the deepest layer of this journey, the point where all symbols dissolve and only understanding remains. Everything that has been explored so far leads to a single realization that is both unsettling and liberating. If Jesus revealed the light of the soul, then his message was never about creating dependency, fear, or blind belief. It was about awakening responsibility, awareness, and inner authority. The most powerful truth is not something to be accepted intellectually, but something to be recognized inwardly. When Jesus declares, "You are the light of the world," he is not offering encouragement in poetic form. He is unveiling a metaphysical reality. The soul, at its core, is luminous consciousness. This light is not earned through moral perfection, nor granted by institutions. It exists prior to belief, prior to doctrine, prior even to language. Jesus speaks from direct realization, and his words carry authority precisely because they point beyond themselves. To understand this, one must grasp the meaning of Christ beyond history. In mystical theology, Christ represents the Logos, the divine intelligence permeating all existence. This intelligence is not distant or abstract. It is the organizing principle of consciousness itself. To awaken the Christ within is to align personal awareness with this deeper order. This is why Paul's words are so radical when taken seriously. It is no longer the fragmented ego that lives, but awakened consciousness expressing itself through the human form. Fear is the greatest obscurer of the soul's light. Fear contracts perception, fragments awareness, and traps consciousness in survival patterns. Jesus confronts fear relentlessly, not through denial, but through transcendence. He speaks of death as sleep, of life as eternal, of loss as gain. These statements are not meant to comfort the anxious mind, but to dismantle it. Eternal life in this understanding is not endless duration after death, but timeless awareness realized now. This realization transforms the meaning of salvation. Salvation is not rescue from punishment, but liberation from ignorance. Ignorance of one's true nature is the original bondage. Jesus addresses this when he speaks of blindness more often than sin. To see clearly is to be free. To remain unconscious is to wander in darkness even while believing oneself righteous. Suffering, then, takes on a new dimension. Jesus never romanticizes pain, yet he reveals its initiatory role. The cross, inwardly understood, is the pressure that exposes false identity. Every human being carries a cross, moments when illusions collapse and control is lost. These moments are not failures, they are thresholds. When resisted, they harden the ego. When accepted with awareness, they ignite transformation. Resurrection is the natural consequence of surrendering false selfhood. Love stands at the center of this awakening. Jesus' command to love without condition is not moral idealism, it is metaphysical instruction. Love dissolves the illusion of separation. Judgment reinforces it. When consciousness perceives unity, love flows naturally. This is why love is inseparable from light. Hatred darkens perception. Compassion clarifies it. To love one's enemy is to refuse the fragmentation of consciousness. The radical nature of Jesus' teaching lies in its demand for inner honesty. There is no one else to blame, no external savior to replace inner work. If the kingdom is within, then awakening is a personal responsibility. This truth is unsettling because it removes excuses, yet it is liberating because it returns power to where it belongs, within awareness itself. Silence becomes essential here, not silence as absence of sound, but as presence without distraction. In stillness, the soul recognizes itself. This is why contemplative practices were central to early mystical Christianity. They were not rituals for approval, but pathways to perception. In silence, the light of the soul reveals itself effortlessly. The final revelation promised from the beginning is this: Jesus did not come to bring light into a dark world. He came to reveal that the world appears dark because humanity has forgotten its own light. Darkness is not an opposing force. It is the absence of awareness. When one soul awakens, darkness diminishes. When many awaken, reality itself shifts. This understanding transforms everyday life. Work becomes expression. Relationships become mirrors. Challenges become teachers. Nothing is outside the path anymore. The sacred is no longer confined to temples or texts. It is recognized in breath, in presence, in attention. The soul's light does not withdraw from the world. It illuminates it. Now reflect deeply and honestly. If you truly accepted that the light of the soul lives within you, how would you live differently? What fears would dissolve? What illusions would no longer hold power? What choices would change if you acted not from fear, but from clarity? The teachings of Jesus endure not because they demand belief, but because they invite awakening. They remain alive because they point to something timeless within you. The journey does not end with words. It begins with awareness. The light you have been seeking has never been distant. It has been waiting patiently, quietly, within the depths of your own soul. Thanks for looking.